I'm extremely excited to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's great to see an old friend and to make some new ones. And I want to thank you all for coming and listening to me talk about one of my favorite topics, which is how we use new technology in order to understand a very old problem, the spread of nuclear weapons. The way I'm going to tell this story is by showing you 3 pictures taken from satellites to illustrate the new way that we go about studying the spread of nuclear weapons. Before I do that, I want to talk broadly about why the world is changing so dramatically when it comes to really everything we do, not just what I study. The example I always give is to think about how we used to share vacation photographs. Most of the people in this room are very young, so this is how your parents did it. This is how I had to do it when I was very young. If you think about it, first of all, to take a photograph, you had to have a camera, like that. A single-use object. It only does one thing, takes pictures. But back then, it wasn't a digital camera. So to take a picture, you literally made an analog recording of an image on an object, a roll of film. And you had to fill that roll of film. And then when you were done, you had to literally take the roll of film out of the camera and take it to be developed. Now, if you plan to share these vacation photographs, you had to remember to ask the people who are going to develop it to make copies. And a human being would physically develop your film into physical objects, right, photographs. Now, you might think you're going to remember the people and the places and the time forever. I am now old. I know that is untrue. You will forget. What you should do is turn the photograph over and on the back, write down all of the data. When it was taken, where it was taken, and who's in it. And if you wanted to share that photograph, you would have to put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, write someone's address, and then give it to the post office, where another series of human beings would hand deliver it to someone. And then that person could open up the envelope, take out the picture, and you had shared a vacation photograph. However, that person only has one copy and they can't share it with anyone else. That's what it was like in the past. Today, think about your phone. Your phone does all of those things. It has a camera. It can take a video. It can take as many pictures or videos as you want. In theory, it's possible to fill up your phone, but that's very hard to do. It collects all the data, when it was taken, where it was taken. If you put it on Facebook, Facebook will identify the faces in the picture. And the phone immediately accesses the internet, so you can share this picture with everyone in the world. And people can then turn around and share your picture with everyone they know. And this is how things go viral. What has happened is that the cost of collecting, storing, and sharing information has fallen to almost nothing. So we had satellite imagery in the past, but it was not available to those of us on the outside. And the kind of satellite imagery we had was different from what we have today. And so it's that transformation driven by technology that I want to talk about. Because just as technology is changing how we share information and how we live, Akiyama Sensei mentioned, for example, contactless payments. Those changes are also changing how we study international security. So this is the first picture that I want to show you, the first story I want to tell you about how things are changing. This is a satellite image taken by a company called Planet in San Francisco, founded by 2 friends of mine. It is a picture of a location in North Korea called Sohae or Tongchang-ri. where North Korea tests the engines for its new missiles. In 2018, North Korea agreed to dismantle this facility after the Singapore summit with President Trump. But after those negotiations collapsed in Hanoi about a year later, North Korea put it back together. One way in which satellites are changing how we do analysis is how easy it is to ask a company to take a picture, how quickly they can take a picture, and how quickly you can just simply download a picture like that to your computer. 20 years ago, if you wanted a digital picture, they would send it to you on a CD in the mail. In this case, we knew that there were changes happening at Tongchang-ri, and we were very interested. So we asked Planet to take a picture. Planet took 2 pictures on this day, which is really quite a lot. And in one of those pictures, which they took while I was asleep, there was a large shipping container. So we asked them to take a picture one day. I went to bed. They took the picture while I was asleep. I woke up in California, and I just simply downloaded the picture to my computer and saw a shipping container. Now, the way you analyze satellite imagery is you look for patterns. You need to know what's normal and what's not normal. In this location, it's not normal for shipping containers to be at this location, because the only time there is anybody here is when they are going to test a new engine. Kim Jong-un had said he wouldn't test any new engines as part of the Singapore agreement. And so we realized that this was a sign that North Korea was about to break that commitment. We downloaded the image, we processed it, we wrote an analysis of it, and it was on CNN later that afternoon. A few days later, North Korea actually conducted an engine test here, and the day after that, they announced that they had done so. We think this is probably the first time that a non-governmental group successfully identified and announced a violation of a non-proliferation commitment before it happened. That wasn't possible when you had to wait for a CD to arrive in the mail with your picture. So that's one change that I wanted to talk about. The second change is, it's not just that our pictures get to us more quickly. It's that we have so many more pictures. Had a thought. What would happen if you put a cell phone in space to take pictures? Now, they don't use cell phones to take pictures, but they do build small satellites that are about this big. And the advantage of building small satellites, which take advantage of all the same electronics that your phone does, is that they can put many of them in orbit, hundreds of them. And if you have a constellation of hundreds of satellites, then you can do something very ambitious, which is you can take a picture of the Earth every day. Now, there are limitations. The pictures that they take every day are not as sharp as the picture you just saw. These large structures are inflatable domes of the kind that children play football or soccer in. I don't know if you see them. I have a 10-year-old. He plays soccer in one of these domes every weekend. It smells like the inside of a tennis shoe. We had the idea that maybe China was building new silos, underground launch facilities for their missile force. And we knew that when they built such facilities, they often put up one of these large inflatable domes and did the construction underneath it. And because they're large, you can see them even in a picture like this, where the resolution, the sharpness of the picture is 3 meters. And what that means is a pixel size is about 3 meters square. So hard to see a car, but you can definitely see a building. Right? Well, inflatable domes are very large. You can see them quite clearly. And Planet's taking a picture of the entire Earth almost every day. They don't always succeed because there are clouds and occasionally small gaps. But we knew we had a picture of all of China every month. Every month, a complete and full picture of China. And so we thought we could find any new construction. So I asked my colleague Decker Eveleth to design a search strategy. Where would China build new silos? And to look. And what would you look for? And he said, well, I'm going to look for these large inflatable structures. This would be impossible with high-resolution satellite imagery, because high-resolution pictures are close-ups. So they take a small, tiny picture, like a picture of a small area. But medium-resolution pictures like this, right, you can get a picture of the whole world. So we had a fresh picture of all of China. And we're getting a new one every month, every few weeks, actually. And so Decker went through all the areas where he thought China might build such underground launch sites and found a field of more than 100 of these inflatable structures, arrayed in a way that made it clear that this was a new silo field. Now, China really previously only had about 100 ICBMs that could strike the United States. So to see 100 new silos being constructed was an enormous find. And shortly after Decker found that, other people started looking, and other people found 2 more fields. This is one of the most dramatic changes that we have ever seen in a country's nuclear posture. And while I'm sure that some governments knew about it, it's also the first time that non-governmental experts were able to detect such a change on essentially the same timeline as the US government. Because we were getting the pictures at the same time they were, and all we had to do was look. This last picture is not from North Korea or China, it's from Russia. And it looks a little different than the other 2 pictures you saw, because it's not really a picture at all. This image is a computer-generated image that shows radar data. So a satellite in space sends microwaves to Earth. They strike the Earth and they bounce back. They're recorded, and the radar data can be represented as a picture. So you can see roads. The roads are black. The roads are not black because the pavement is black. The roads are black because they're smooth. And the microwave beams bounce off them. You see fields and trees, which are sort of gray and fuzzy. But they're not gray and fuzzy because leaves are kind of soft and small. They're fuzzy because leaves are all at different angles, so they reflect some of the microwaves, but not all. And then you see houses and military vehicles, which are bright white. And they're not bright white because that's the color they're painted, because they're green, but because they strongly reflect microwaves. So it's not really a picture, although it looks like one. It's really just data. It's data about how strongly these objects in the ground reflect microwaves, the time it took, which is the distance for the microwave to reach the ground and come back, and other similar kinds of numerical information. What's great about radar imagery is microwaves pass right through clouds. So I said Planet tries to take a picture of the Earth every day, but sometimes they can't get a picture because it's cloudy. It's always cloudy in Ukraine in February. We took many, many optical pictures of places like this, and all we saw were clouds. But the radar pictures were always clear. And in this particular case, what you're looking at is a Russian military unit the day before the war, the day before the invasion began. And what was notable to us about this unit is that all the vehicles, it's hard to see, but all the vehicles are lined up along roads in lines, which means that they're not parked in order to stay. It means they're waiting on the side of the road in order to invade Ukraine. It's hard to interpret an image like this. We had a little help. Someone drove by these military vehicles and recorded them with a phone and made a TikTok video and put it online. It's very strange, right? And so we were able to determine that this was a Russian military unit that was going to be one of the first ones to invade Ukraine. And we immediately called CNN and said, the invasion's going to start tomorrow. Here's the picture. Do you know what CNN said? We can't see it. So we were very disappointed. So we sat in our office feeling a little glum and wondering how we might see the invasion start. Then it occurred to us to look at Google Maps. Do you use Google Maps to get to school or to work? It tells you the traffic, right? Well, we were looking at Google Maps and we saw on this road right here, at 3 o'clock in the morning in Russia, a traffic jam. There usually aren't traffic jams at 3 o'clock in the morning. What was happening is the Russians were putting up roadblocks so that no one could drive. And we were able to use the traffic data in Google Maps to determine that this unit, which we had identified in a radar image, was on its way to Ukraine. And we watched them slowly move down the road all the way to the border. We announced the invasion was starting on Twitter. No one believed us. And then a few hours later, the bombs fell. These are 3 instances which I think really illustrate what I'm trying to tell you about what your phones mean. The lesson is that the cost of collecting and storing and sharing information now is almost 0. And that means that we can not only get all kinds of amazing pictures from space, whether they are high-resolution pictures taken at demand, whether they are low-resolution images of the whole Earth taken every day, or whether they are pictures that aren't even pictures at all, that are just radar. We can analyze those wherever we live, and we can tell the whole world about it immediately. And to me, that is an extremely exciting and unbelievable way to do the work that we have always wanted to do. Thank you.
And I want to thank the organizers for this great event, and really looking forward to exchanging ideas with all of you. So today I would like to talk about what we do at Copernic. Copernic, that's an organization that I co-founded 13 years ago. And we are trying to do things differently to have a better impact in development sector. So just to, as a background, I have spent first half of my career mostly with the UN, and I worked in different countries. Timor-Leste, immediately after the independence. I also worked in the immediate aftermath of tsunami, earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia. I was also in West Africa, Sierra Leone. Then dealt with some of the very first peace building fund project. And I was also involved in some of the UN reform initiatives in New York. And I was really enjoying everything within the system. but I started to feel a little bit uneasy because I wanted to do more. And I'll tell you a few incidents that triggered me to think about doing things differently. I talked about tsunami and earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia, and I was in Indonesia, and a lot of companies started to approach the UN. Coca-Cola came, Yamaha came, Toyota, and some of those consulting firms came, and they said, look, I know this is really a significant disaster, and we want to help you guys. And UN side, it was not ready to respond to those offers. Some of the issues, I think, is ideological. Oh, these are the for-profit companies. They want to make money out of this disaster. We should not work with them. And other people said, actually, they should just give us money. We don't know how to work with them. But all these companies actually wanted to use their expertise to help, not just giving money. And this was kind of stuck in my mind, like, oh, okay, so there's a lot of players wanting to help and take part in development. And we need to figure out how. And then I was looking at the fund flow with a World Bank colleague. So immediately after the tsunami, a lot of support were expressed, right? And then the government of Indonesia also decided to allocate significant amount of funding, $2 billion from the Indonesian government side. And the multilateral, which is like the UN and the World Bank, pledged $1.3 billion. Bilaterals, USAID and JICA, etc., 2 billion plus. And then private companies, the amount of money that was coming in from this actor was quite big. And this is really changed the thinking of myself and a lot of other people involved in development. There is a huge potential here, but public institutions like the UN has not figured out how to leverage this funding. And then there's also many other things happening in international development. Off-grid areas, people are burning kerosene light to have very dim lighting with very harmful smoke coming out. And then there are a lot of startup companies making and designing and producing very clean energy, low-cost light to replace these kerosene lanterns. And by the way, this is one of the most popular products, LED light for the developing countries. But this was developed by these very young guys in their 20s, they're Stanford graduate, and no significant development background. I say this because in the UN system, if you don't have 5 years of experience in development, or if you don't have degrees from reputable institutions on development, it's very difficult to get a job. So these guys who would probably not hired by the UN institutions, and they are making much bigger changes in the landscape. And I also saw that the MIT's some universities were also trying to bring a different type of ideas into development. As you know, MIT is an engineering university, but they were actually leveraging very low cost and simple technologies, testing them to be used in the poor communities. And also there are a lot of other things happening. Funding flow started to change. The global giving, which is now kind of established, I think they've been around for nearly 20 years, but they're one of the first ones to enable individual donors to support different development projects. They use credit card and PayPal, etc., and then fund project. Very different way of fund flows compared to the ODA, which is basically dependent on the taxpayers' money. And Kiva, again, they're also peer-to-peer, so individuals funding projects, but this was lending for entrepreneurs. So there are a lot of new things happening, and we thought, okay, I was kind of trying to do new things within the UN, but at some point, okay, I think maybe it's easier if I create a separate entity and do things that I was interested in doing. So key approach, we wanted to engage multiple partners, including unusual suspects. We want to take risks and try new things. Let's use a lot of data and aim for collective impact. And that led to the activities of Copernic, which activities of ours includes finding unmet needs and test potential solutions and find effective solutions through the testing and share with others. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this in the coming slide. So if we think about innovation process, right, we need to have, of course, clearly recognized problems. That's the first step. And in order to address those problems, there are many, many ways of doing it. And out of which more promising ones, we actually conduct a lean experiment. And based on which the result, we say, okay, maybe this has more potential, let's do it in a larger scale. And we stop here. And we want this widespread adoption by others. We are not growing ourselves. We basically are trying to play an R&D role. So we stay lean, but trying to have more impact in this sector. So the first one, unmet needs identification. So what are the remaining challenges in the developing countries? And we used to do a lot of this very typical report. And there's a paper version, and there is online PDF versions, and looking at the different aspects of, let's say, smallholder farmers' challenges. What are they growing? What are the bottlenecks? Why are the price so low when middleman buys the crops, etc.? And at some point, we thought, I think we should talk about these challenges in a different way as well, in addition to this traditional report, which led to the creation of the VR for SDGs. And this is a platform to share the challenges, articulate the challenges that exist in the poor communities. And we'll have a session after this. You all have an opportunity to try this. But this is using the 360 video. So you can actually look around you. You can look down and have a more immersive experience and better understand the context and then challenges themselves. And we were using it in some of the international conferences when we were talking about our activities. And we also started an online program with University of Melbourne and then Gajah Mada University. And so they used to have, this is part of the master's program in international development. And part of this program was a field trip. And they were sending students to different parts of Indonesia. And when the COVID hit, they were no longer able to do that. And they came to us. I saw your VR thing. Can we do something with the VR? And then so we decided to basically go to different locations and document different types of challenges that communities are facing, and then use that video as part of the class and discuss why this issue exists what can we do about it? So that was some of the content of the class. And after that, we started to get some interest and then started to also conduct similar classes in other institutions, including Hitotsubashi. And so what we do is, for example, this was some of the topics that we picked for the Melbourne universities. So the smallholder farmers, what are the challenges? So we have a VR 360 video for that, but that is not enough. So we have a background information and reading list, and plus the non-360 video as well. So we are combining a different type of content to give sufficient information for the students. If this was only 360 video, I think it's fun, but it lacks a lot of information. So it's about complementing the different, more traditional way of sharing information. Now, so the needs, right? I talked about the needs. What are the problems? So the first, that's one of the things that we do. So identifying challenges. But after that, we will generate ideas. Okay, what do we do with these challenges? And conduct lean experiments. And I want to share some example. And this is, unlike Jeffrey's example, this is very, very low-tech. You will probably think like, huh, is this it? But it's very simple. So this is a rubber tree. The rubber farmers cut the bark of the tree to get a latex out of it. And this is an ingredient for a rubber. Right? Very, very important. It's used for tires, etc. Without this, our life will be very, very difficult. And it's in Indonesia. And the farmer told us that they have a big problem, which is rain. During the rainy season, which lasts for 3 or 4 months within a year, this latex is washed away, and their income will disappear. Okay, rain. And the farmer himself had some ideas. I think we need something like this. That's all. Okay, a hat. You need a hat? And I said, okay, well, but do we need, like he said, I don't think I should buy like 500 hats. So we talked about the different ideas and then came up with this extremely simple rain guard, which can be produced using the locally available materials only. So something like this, right? But we shouldn't stop here because we don't know if this works or not. Now let's do an experiment. Okay, so there are trees without this shield and trees with these shields. And we had these 2 types of rain guards because this one was much cheaper, but it was too soft, and we were not sure if this will actually stop the spoilage. And so we did put these into different trees, 75 trees in total, and we collected the data on the amount of latex that can be collected through these trees. The gray bar is the latex from trees without, so basically the baseline. And orange, the 2 different versions, had a lot more latex collected. So this extremely simple idea resulted in a significant reduction in the latex loss. So we do conduct that kind of very simple experiment, but we also work with different companies, startups, big companies, like Benesse. We were testing very simple educational toys, basically repeating the multiplication process. That's how you remember. And this is a toy with Mitsubishi Electric. This is a portable fridge for the fish sellers who are selling fish, carrying the fish in the bucket, but it goes bad because it's so hot. So this is the fridge, or with Unilever, malaria or dengue prevention product. So we kind of do a lot of collaboration to test early stage product concept, product ideas. And also universities play a huge role. So with some of the universities in Asia or US, Europe, especially with the engineering schools, engineers come and they kind of come up with a very simple design, and we test, we collect data, and some of them actually get used in a larger scale. So we work with a lot of different universities. Now, what are we going to do with this result, right? So we have this platform we call a solutions catalog, where we put the result of the experiment. And you see this effectiveness rating. 4 bars, actually very good. So on top it's a rubber rain guard. Because that worked very well, we are putting on the top. And if you go down, there are many, many other projects with a different rating. But if we look at the aggregate, out of 39 experiments that we conduct, very strong accounts for only 5%. And moderate, which is like, okay, it worked fine, but not really, is a majority. And so this is really telling us and reminding us that it's not that easy to solve those challenges. But it's so important to keep trying. So this is, so and then one of the things, so I said we stop here, but what we want is one of the things that we want is a replication. So if solution is effective, we want other organizations to adopt, not us making it bigger, but others to adopt. And this is actually recently happened with the GIZ, which is a German equivalent of JICA or USAID. They learned about our rain guard. They are also supporting the rubber farmers. And then they adopted a few thousand rain guards to provide to the rubber farmers in Indonesia. So that's really great development. And another thing that we do is a spin-off. So if something goes well, we actually spin off. So we have actually spun off 3 organizations out of us. One was Rumbia, it's a non-profit. Second one is called the Perfect Fit. This is a reusable menstrual pad for schoolgirls. And because one of the challenges that we found was one taboo around the menstrual hygiene, and also the waste produced through the disposable pad that people were using. So we did an experiment, and then the team worked on this project, decided that they're gonna make this into an independent company. So it's been running for the last 2-3 years. And recently, last month, two months ago, we had another spin-off called Magi Farm, which they try to build a circular economy out of food waste. So there are a lot of food waste, right? We don't finish food, we just discard. And in Indonesia, these go to the dump site and produce methane, etc. Now, we did an experiment with larvae of a black soldier fly. These larvae actually eat a lot of food waste. So any kind of food waste they eat, and they eat twice as much as their weight every day. So I'm 74 kilogram. So it's like I eat 150 kilos of food every day. That's how much these larvae eat, and convert into protein, right? And so these larvae become food for livestock, such as this koi, duck, or pig, or they're even creating for dogs and cats. So this is the third spin-off that we created. So that's what we do. We are always looking out for interesting innovations. We test it, we try it in in the field, and some of the innovations can be high-tech, and some of the innovation can be extremely low-tech, but we are trying and take risk to find what really works to solve the problems in the poor communities. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Good evening from New York City. My name is Maarten Waehlisch. I work in the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and in the UN Secretariat, I lead a team that is tasked with bringing in new technologies and methods to the work of conflict prevention, peacemaking, and peacebuilding. And let me also say that I'm thankful for being invited to speak to you, but I'm also sad that I didn't have the chance to actually come to Japan. I feel we live in this world of digital communication, while it is even more important to actually meet in person and get together after those years and living through the pandemic. Now, before I start, I wanted to make a confession. I'm not a computer engineer. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a lawyer by profession. But I'm equally a tech enthusiast, and I'm certainly also a science fiction consumer at night. My past in the UN has brought me to places like the Middle East. I've worked in Yemen and Lebanon. I've worked on the conflict in Afghanistan, Kosovo, many other places. And I've been fascinated over the last decade or so by the affordances of new technologies and innovation to help bring forward the UN's peace agenda. Now, when we think about the United Nations, on one side, we have in mind the new affordances of new technologies, and we want to apply artificial intelligence, big data mining, large language models to the context of peace. But at the same time, you will find places in the UN Secretariat, like the one you see on the picture on the left, a card that says UN Docs, where you find papers on that people push to conference rooms. So while this organization tries to live up to the spirit of the 21st century and the affordances of the fourth industrial revolution, we are still pretty much struggling with the challenges of a large bureaucracy and the limitations that we have as an international organization. Now, the question is, why does innovation matter? And we have to realize that we live in a time where we see new conflict challenges, new conflict realities. Think about the dark side of the digital world, which we call the Wide Web, but also issues related to mis and disinformation that have certainly changed the way of how conflicts are carried out. It's not just between states anymore, but we've seen an influx, an increase of non-state actors that certainly play a role. The Ukraine was mentioned, and much of the conflict regarding the Ukraine is not carried out through formal negotiations, but pretty much as well on TikTok and other social media channels that influence the hearts and minds and influence the political discord as large. There are new challenges that are simply related to the existential climate crisis. We have seen an increase of migration caused by climate change more than by armed conflict, and that has also changed the way of how diplomacy can be carried out. And likewise, the pandemic has really taught us over the last years that although everybody desires a handshake, we have seen that digital communications has equally allowed the international community to communicate and build consensus beyond boundaries using modern ways of communication. And I think the sheer fact that I'm speaking to you from New York City at an evening, on those issues are kind of an example of that. I think 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had that conversation at ease as we have it nowadays. And all of that, those new conflict realities require us to think about new ways and means to address conflict. Now, the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has brought forward a range of initiatives over the last years, starting with a digital compact that brings the different private and public entities on digital issues together, culminating in the Common Agenda proposal last year. And that Common Agenda includes a proposal for the UN 2.0, and that entails 5 elements that are called the quintet issues, including data, issues related to innovation at large, strategic foresight, so ways of thinking about the future or the futures in plural in a more structured way, issues related to behavioral science, so how do we generate pro-social choice, learning from cognitive and brain sciences in any ways that help us to better measure performance and end results. So this is kind of a chapeau of the UN 2.0, and you will see various activities coming from the UN system addressing those issues to bring the organization up to speed to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Now, in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, we cover innovation in a two-folded way. One is that we don't fetishize or glorify new technologies. As said, we live in this fourth industrial revolution, and I think it's impossible to think away new technologies, but we are addressing new technologies in a careful and in a responsible way. So we look, and it was mentioned just in the presentation before, at what is the problem at hand, what are the challenges we face before we sort out solutions that might include technical solutions. And the second dimension of this endeavor is really to make space for experimentation, for speculative approaches, and to allow ourselves failure, but also then to fall forward and learn from those failures. The UN has really ramped up its innovation capacities. We now have 67 innovation entities in the UN universe. That includes innovation entities among the agency pros and funds. So think about the World Food Program or the Refugee Agency or the Children's Fund. So all the different parts of the UN have now dedicated innovation capacities to address new practices and new ways of thinking. For us on the peace and security side, that ranges really from thinking about geospatial remote sensing. I'll give you a quick example on this in a second, as well as immersive storytelling. We just talked about the affordances of virtual reality, but a lot of the work we do spins around social media listening, ways of how we can engage with the public in a peace process, how we can mine large volume of text, given that diplomacy is mostly text or speech based, and I can transcribe speech into text and I can mine that to use the power of new technologies for sense making. And then 2 non-tech related issues are equally relevant: structured thinking about the future, foresight, that includes anticipatory decision making, as well as ways that are at the nexus of human machines that we call behavioral science interventions, where we think about how we can structure and engineer pro-social choice. Now, just as a quick footnote on geospatial work, as it was mentioned in the first presentation, we draw from the affordances of new tech. CubeSats were mentioned, small satellites, high cadence of imagery that we apply to detect water shortages in the Middle East, for instance, where we can basically triangulate various geospatial information drawn from open source Earth observation data sets that are environmental satellites, and then we basically triangulate that with past experience on armed conflict to predict water shortage. So a very concrete example where open source information are used to advance conflict prevention here in the context of water shortage in the Middle East. Second example, we just spoke about what it was of virtual reality or enhanced realities, XR at large. In January 2022, last year, we briefed the Security Council, first time in the chamber in virtual reality. That was on the context of Colombia. And this has been a recurrent now method in the council. We repeated this in July last year, and we're just looking at another session of the council, this time on Lebanon, using virtual realities and ways of creative storytelling. Again, this hasn't been new. We have always tried to find innovative methods of bringing in a TV screen into the council chamber or just a map. And this is really just an add-on to the different types of briefings the council receives. And that's not the future, that's actually the reality. We're building the metaverse for the United Nations and ways to use virtual spaces for confidential conversations. Now, I wanted to also highlight that this is not just for diplomats, but also certainly a tool that we are exploring for peace building, where we can do body swaps and ways to walk each other's journey. Here you see an example of how we are using VR in Colombia to give youth a feeling for what it's like to be in different parts of the country and hear the story of former FARC members or victim groups. And that's certainly an area that is still underexplored scientifically speaking. If you think about different scientific studies that kind of contradict each other, it's not yet clear whether VR really increases empathy or lasting memory. Those are things that are literally just to be explored as we use them. So I'm going back to the point that I mentioned earlier. We are treating this in a very careful way to not rush into technical solutions without having it properly tested, and we address it from a responsible point of view. Now, let me zoom in on three things: social media listening, digital dialogue, where we use artificial intelligence, and then the future science fiction of how we use new imaginatives, just to broaden the perspective. Now, when we think about social media, a lot of the work that has helped us get a sense for political polarization is to map out topics and stances, aka sentiments, on different social media platforms. Here, take the example of Yemen, where we can map out how political conversations on social media might mirror social engagement on the ground. Yes, we are mindful that social media is used only by a fraction of the population, and likewise, we carry out studies to better understand how many people have access to the internet, how many people are on Facebook, on Twitter. In many places that we operate, social media is secondary. Radio and television is king. And we then use this as a way to either confirm biases that might exist when it comes to political analysis or fill in blind spots. So this is an additional signal for us for political analysis. It's not going to be the truth, whatever that means, but it's going to be an additional vector for conversation, additional vector for political analytical products that we produce. The same goes for cross-platform analysis. Take the example here of unpacking coordinated inauthentic behavior. So ways where we can get a sense for mis and disinformation, and that is cross-platform analysis to get a sense for, how conversations here on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube drive a certain narrative that might be true on the ground or just create noise to camouflage political intention. Or here another example from our social media work where we map out digital armies to get a sense for the quantity and quality of political followership. That gives us a sense for the emergence of new political actors, for instance, that have followership on social media, but not yet political alliances on the ground. Or they give us a sense for silence as well. I think when it comes to social media, it's equally important what we don't see, right? If we don't see certain things, that gives us also a signal for the suppression, for instance, of political participation, or think about the internet blackouts where the states turn off the internet. And that also tells us a lot about what's actually happening there. Maybe not in detail exactly kind of what the dynamics are, but that something is happening there. This has led to a range of applications that we produce in-house. Here an example of a Twitter monitoring tool that we built in the United Nations that gives bureaucrats, international officials, a quick snapshot of conversations on Twitter. And we continue this journey where we build open source applications that we have full control over, where we understand the source code and that we can modify to the needs and requirements of the organization in comparison to just buying solutions from the private market. We are focusing more on open source, internally built applications that are then, again, kind of objective and transparent and live up to the spirit of this organization. Now, another example I wanted to bring to your attention, because it's in the public domain, is Diplomatic Pulse. If you go to diplomaticpulse.org, you have access to a data set that we have been populating for the last years. It's a web scraper that scrapes press statements of all 193 member states, both their permanent missions, so their embassies to the United Nations, including their foreign ministries. And this gives you a quick idea of what the world thinks with regard to a certain issue. This is basically a Google for diplomats, and we started this as an endeavor to do the data collection and looking now at large language models unpacking diplomatic language. Think about how the Security Council communicates, or the Secretary General, when the Secretary General is highly concerned about the situation in the Ukraine. The terminology highly, for instance, is an intensifier. Concerned would be an issue that would warrant attention. And I brought you here the example from February 2023, just a few weeks ago, a statement attributed to the Secretary General where you can unpack diplomatic signals in a press release. Here, the word Korea gives you a sense for location. Condemning, using certain verbs, give you a sense for stance. So that's a sentiment. And an intensifier when the Secretary General is strongly or highly or very concerned. So it gives you a greater sense for urgency. And then there's always a message in a press communication that asks for action, here calling on the DPRK to immediately desist from any other further actions. Now, I've explained this to you now here in a manual way. Imagine you could do this with a machine learning, where you can apply this to hundreds of thousands of statements from all member states to get a sense for trends and developments. And this is where machines can be very helpful to unpack diplomatic signals and give us basically developments and trends at scale. We can apply the same for radio and television mining. As mentioned, social media might be prominent in some parts of the world, and many places that we operate in, radio and television is king. I lived in the Middle East, and the best source for information was radio talk shows in the morning from 8 to 9. I would sit in the car in traffic and listen to what people say on the radio. And you can also mine that, because speech can be transcribed and then mined according to keywords or certain sentiments. And that, again, gives us an additional vector in the conversation for making sense of a situation on the ground, in comparison to just reading mainstream news or using our human intelligence network, of course, of analysts and sources that we have in conflict zones. Now, how do we use artificial intelligence to enhance inclusivity? The first examples I gave you was more on the analytical side. Now, let me draw you to your attention a bit of what we do to engage with peace constituencies. And when you think about peace processes, here I took the example of the Libyan political dialogue process. You can fit only so many people into a room. Here in the context of Libya, it was around 75 delegates, vis-a-vis over 7 million people. And that's a true challenge for peace negotiations. And even in the context of Yemen, where the national dialogue had over 500 delegates, in comparison to over 30 million Yemenis, we see constraints when it comes to peace processes, either space, time, other resources. Now, what if you could combine the power of a poll, a survey, which usually means 1,000 people plus, right? When you conduct a survey, you can scout the public opinions of 1,000 people plus. If you could combine this with the intimacy of a focus group, and the beauty of a focus group is that you have a smaller group that listens to each other's answers and that can respond to the conversations. What if you could combine the power of a poll and the intimacy, the flexibility of a focus group? This is where artificial intelligence comes into the game. We teamed up with a private sector partner, the company is called Remesh, that helped us modify a tool that is used in the marketing field, basically a tool that is used in the private sector to scout sentiments with regard to products. What do people think in conflict zone or non-conflict zones on Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Nike, and so forth? And this tool has been repurposed for peace processes, where you can basically, in a text-based conversation, have a conversation with 1,000 people on an issue related to a peace process. And that gives us greater inclusivity and makes solutions eventually also more durable. Here, an example from Yemen. We started this during the pandemic. This is text-based, so it allows also the participants to stay fully anonymous. They would only reveal some demographic information about themselves, like age, gender, self-identified location, but they wouldn't appear with their picture, they wouldn't appear with their sound, or any way that gives their identification away. So it creates a safe space for them. We had over hundreds of Yemenis participating in the first dialogue over 3 years ago, And we repeated this at various occasions. Here, the example of Libya, where the special envoy at the time engaged with the public at large. This dialogue was picked up by national television, and we had over 4 million people watching the dialogue, where we had over 2,000 youth from Libya having a conversation with the highest UN representative. That's facilitated through artificial intelligence that allows you to basically get a snapshot of those views on the spot. It uses machine learning for semantic similarities. So it clusters answers in a way where those answers are presented to you on a dashboard, so that as a participant, you see what 1,000 people say, you can respond to that in real time. While a poll, for instance, would at least take you 4 up to 6 weeks to get results, and it wouldn't be as interactive. So here, a good example, I think, of new technologies helping us to increase inclusivity in peace processes. We build solutions that work in conflict zones where it's already very hard to charge your phone, where individuals have to make a choice whether they want to engage with the UN or call their loved ones. So we build easy-to-use applications, again, with the aim to get citizens engaged, have their voices heard, and also particularly reach out to communities that are usually not part of formal peace negotiations. Now, the last point that I wanted to flag to you is the future of diplomacy. If virtual reality is already part of the UN's toolbox, if we already use satellites to predict water shortage, if we use machine learning to unpack social media signals, and we use artificial intelligence to have conversations in real time with 1,000 people plus in 2023, facilitated by the UN, how will the future of diplomacy look like? And let me just recall what Roy Amara said, who was a futurist in the United States, who made the following comment. And I'm going to unpack that with you in a second, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the Q&A session. He said that we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run, and we underestimate the effect in the long run. I think it means that we usually are rushing into a hype when we see a new type of technology. And then we quickly get disappointment because the human expectation is that this type of technology will gradually grow. The truth is that technology sees ups and downs, especially in the startup phase, where the ripeness is not there yet. Take the example of GPT-3, large language models that are now more sophisticatedly available for the mainstream population, where the AI might not give you the answers you might look for. There's a hype, we might see a disappointment, but the truth is that those technologies, those groundbreaking, innovative technologies are not going to go away. They're going to incrementally entrench our life and change the way of how we work and live. So again, we overestimate the impact at the beginning, then we see a down because we get disappointed, and then our perception is that there's not much worth in the technology, so that's why we underestimate the long-term trends. That's interesting. That's important when we think about the future. Just a few visuals here from our work that we started a few years ago at the mark of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The UN was not born yesterday, but has been in business since the end of the Second World War. And it's pretty hard, to be honest, to reimagine the United Nations. So if you think about the UN 50 years from now, will there be a role for technology, or will we stay away from tech because of the fears that we have encountered over the years? So those are all questions, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for your attention, and thanks so much for having me with you. Back to you.
Lighting up.
Well, no, take your time. Take your time.
It's much clearer. And
Oh, holy cow. That's so well done.
You get the sense.
Oh, right.
welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the VR experience.
And so what we are going to do is to perhaps spend about an hour and to go a little deeper into the kinds of issues that were raised during the first part. So my first question to the speakers is as follows: the state of play. You introduced amazing techniques. Do you think that in your respective field, those digital or innovative tools have become a mainstream instruments? Or are you still very much a pioneer and a minority? How do you see your area moving forward with the kinds of approaches that you shared with us this morning?
Well, I would say that we are still very much, or we feel very much still like pioneers, and the last example is a good example of that. I think in the weeks and months leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we found ourselves having a lot of arguments with people who had a more traditional way of knowing about international relations. So many of the people we knew who were Russia experts in a traditional way, which, by the way, I think is a very, traditional ways are good. Traditional research methods are excellent. But many Russia experts believed that it was very unlikely that Russia would invade Ukraine because it didn't make sense to them, and because the decision-making in Moscow, we now know, is being held very closely. And so traditional ways of knowing let us down. They let us down because no one in Moscow believed an invasion was coming, and so experts, I think, correctly reflected that sense that no one in Moscow thought this would happen. And they let us down because many people tried to reason through what Putin might do because we couldn't ask him. And those traditional methods, which often work, did not work in this case. On the other side were my colleagues who were saying very clearly that we could see the signs of the invasion coming. We could see the large numbers of troops, and importantly, we could see that the troop buildup did not look like previous exercises. So when the Russian government said this was just an exercise, we could say, well, here are pictures of exercises. They aren't this big. They don't involve large field hospitals. They don't involve this kind of equipment. And so it's not that we're always right and they're always wrong. I don't want to say that at all, because it's very difficult to interpret satellite imagery. But I think that people are now, only just now, beginning to accept that this is a new way of knowing about international security and treating this kind of approach as being comparable and just as acceptable as more traditional ways.
That's fascinating. It's almost a clash of culture, no, between the conventional methods and the new techniques and approaches, in a way that the knowledge can prohibit the open-mindedness towards the situation. Martin, would you feel the same way on the UN side? You kind of hinted at how we're still in the very conventional, paper-oriented culture. Do you have a bit of the do you feel like you hit the wall sometimes within the matchbox?
The UN has nearly 40 floors, so there are many walls you can hit. It feels like a maze, and certainly I think you invited tech and futures enthusiasts here, so all of us I think are excited about the future. I have three thoughts to your question whether or not those tools and approaches are already mainstream. My first thought is that time will tell, and change takes time. When you just look at the VR work, we have now produced over 6 VR experiences for the Council since 2019. We have run over 10 digital dialogues in 10 countries around the world over the last 3 years. And we have up to 800 active social media analysis users for the tools we built, and thousands of analytical products that were based on data just in the last 18 months. So we have seen an increase of uptake of those new tools, but change will take time. That's my first thought. The second thought goes back to the structure of how change happens, and kind of the textbooks tell us that it happens in 3 steps. Number one, you need to create infrastructure, policy infrastructure, like the UN 2.0 Quintet action plan, a data strategy for the organization, the team that I'm leading. So you have to create the infrastructure. Second, you have to build capacity. So you have to make staff knowledgeable about new skills. And in that context, we have been running trainings for the last 5 years, training up to 1,000 people. And we're seeing slowly the fruits of this training coming to light because of the products and the requests we are seeing. So you have to build capacities. And the third one is scale. And that's where the real transformation happens, where those tools are not innovative anymore, but they just need to be maintained because they are part of the regular budget of the United Nations and part of the regular toolkit. We're not there yet. Now, third point is that the workforce is changing. When I started this team 3 years ago, I was not even able to hire a data scientist in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. The job profile did not exist. I could hire a statistician, but that's not necessarily a data scientist. So we had to change the job profiles. Now, in 2023, I can hire data scientists, and we have already a number of data scientists that joined the organization. So the workforce has changed. You can study computational international relations, a crossover of computer science and international relations. You can study brain science in the context of public affairs, something unthinkable a few years ago. So the workforce is changing, and with that, inherently, also the scale will change in just a few years from now. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Martin. I confess, I think I was a participant in one of your first training sessions, so I benefit a lot from it. And I think it's actually really encouraging in that if you want to do international relations, you can also study data science and go to the UN. The path to the work that we do is no longer confined to politics or diplomacy. We can do other things and end up actually working towards world peace. And I think that's really encouraging development. Toshi-san, you work a lot with businesses than us, more so than the UN side. Do you see the landscape differently, that they are more open to innovation?
I think the big organizations, be it private or public, have a challenge of doing new things. Once you become so big, you have rules, you have structures, you have cultures, and it becomes more and more difficult to remain innovative. So I think we do work with big companies, and they're struggling to get this approval for the new project. So I think it's probably not only in the big public sector, but I think the large institutions will all face some of the challenges.
In the development growth, do you also see that the digital or innovation become mainstream, or are you also facing the same constraints?
So when I started Copernic 13 years ago, nobody was talking about innovation. And so when I was talking to my colleagues at that time saying, hey, I'm going to start this organization, we do things differently, and they're looking at me like, what? Why are you leaving? You have some promising career, etc. But it started to change. I think probably 7-8 years ago, UN started to talk about innovation, and then some of the funds and programs started to have innovation lab, innovation hub, or whatever the teams within the organization. So UNDP, UNICEF was the first one, UNDP created, and FPA, UNHCR, they started to create, and we started to work with them. And some of those people are very excited about bringing a new initiative to these big organizations. And actually I see that it's kind of dying down a bit. I think maybe it's what, as Martin said, there was an over-expectation on the immediate impact of innovation, and then I think maybe the senior management is losing patience. And also there's a cultural issue. In the innovation team, I've seen a lot of young people in hoodies and not really wearing proper UN type of clothes. And the people in the more traditional teams, they don't really value what they can bring to the organization. And they will look at, what educational background do they have? How many years of experience do they have? And do they study, this international development? And I think this kind of very culture made it difficult for this innovation team to fully realize their potential. And I've seen, unfortunately, some of the friends that was leading the innovation work in the UN agencies, they've left. But I'm actually remaining optimistic because this is not something that you need to ignore. All the new things will continue to come. It will continue to affect the institution. And unless the UN responds quickly, it will become irrelevant. So I think there will continue to be innovative exploration within the system.
Thank you. Probably I shouldn't just listen to the people, so I'd like to make a couple of comments, and also would like to ask you to respond to my questions. All presentations reminds me of the importance of the context, where you put this high tech or technology into the proper context. For example, in case of Jeffrey's case, probably the literacy really matters, right? So he suggested the big discrepancies about understanding between the old guards of kind of Russian studies and tech people, right? So eventually his team was correct in terms of assessment of the sort of how close the war was in fact. So, but without proper context, how you analyze the sort of signals, what this the picture means, then without it, probably we are not able to have a proper assessment. So I'm actually probably from the old guys of this regional studies or more policy studies side. So I would like to emphasize the importance of context. So you still need actually the basic, or not really basic, but real knowledge on international relations in order to have a proper understanding of the technology. That's one thing. The other is, obviously the technology makes the world much, flatter the place. And so I think that means that we have a much closer gap in information between the government and society. And as an analyst, I was always told by many people that 80 to 9% of critical information is available in the public domains. So, but then I think technology gets further and empower the side of non-governmental sectors. So, in that sense, I think that the non-governmental sector can play more significant roles in peace and security as well as like Toshi does. So that's the second thing. The third is I was very much impressed with the quoted by Martin about overestimation and underestimation in the depending on time frame. The question probably is, we are still at the stage of making a fair and a proper balance or combination between technology, sort of mathematics, or quantitative approach with qualitative approaches. So I think it's still under the process of making a better methodology of integrating these three different approaches. The maybe challenge for us is that we are still doing, because we are still at the stage of development, we may have to have a kind of a better estimate or assessment of the proper impact of this technology. So I think we probably would like to develop the measurements, the methodology to measure the effectiveness, particularly, this VR, I think you experienced, but it's so amazing. The picture we saw from the VR is so vivid, so we feel like we are there. And because of that, we may have kind of overestimate about the impact of this picture. The Martin was showing the Security Council members using this VR technology, and they got strong impressions about the conflict zones. But then, would it really appropriately affect the way they decide when they make a decision? So I'm kind of it's kind of devil's advocate, but I'd like to pitch in these questions and would like to hear what you think about these questions.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for picking up on that. I called it responsible technology, and the truth is that we are figuring things out while we are doing it. There is no manual, and the scientific discoveries as they emerge are put to use, and we always try to de-accelerate innovation processes on our end by doing a lot of storytelling around how those innovations are put to use, and then equally we try to measure the impact of those technologies. Let me give you two examples. So one is the use of new technologies, virtual reality for peace building. As I mentioned in my presentation, we went through all the research that is publicly available on whether or not VR generates greater empathy. That's highly disputed in the academic field. There are around 60 studies out there for the last 15 years, and they pointed to different directions. The methodology is not consistent, and the findings are contradictory. Now, what does that mean for us as an organization? We have to do our own studies. So at the moment, we are looking at an IMBIT trial behavior science study in Colombia, where we are testing out the VR Colombia experience in 5 sample groups with around 500 students. So to say that we go into those affordances blindly would be wrong. We kind of de-accelerate the innovation process, spend time and money for not just evaluation, but proper behavior science studies. So that's one example. The other one is the uptake of social media analysis. Do we know whether there is correlation or causation between the production of more data-driven analysis that leads to better decision-making? The jury is out there, whether data-driven decision-making is really leading to better diplomatic results, and that entails then more stability. I think what our approach is that we need to use data and evidence to make decisions less arbitrary and make them based on objective findings that can be disputed, but that are less just driven by subjective narratives. So that's my thinking on that. So responsible tech, de-accelerating innovation, and finding measures to really get a grip on whether geospatial analysis, social media analysis leads to better results. And I think the jury for that is out there, but we need to keep trying in order to indeed, again, counterbalance just assumptions and subjective decision-making, as it is often the case in interhuman communication and even more so in international relations. Back to you.
Thank you, Martin. Toshi-san, how about you? Having this VR available, has it changed anything in concretely?
So first of all, I think Akiyama Sensei's comment is really important. When we were using the VR in Hitotsubashi class, so out of 13 classes, I think 13 or 14, I used only in 2 of them. first of all. And within these two, only 15 minutes. This is because the traditional ways of preparing, doing the reading list, having a conversation, and showing the photos, there are a lot of things that already work. So it's not, the VR is not replacing them. It's only adding the different type of content and different type of experience. So I think the expectation is not that high. But we recognize that there is a potential additionality of using those technologies. And similarly, in the development, for example, the participatory planning, which is very often used in the NGO world, it works because it's important to develop plans together with the community that the NGOs work with. And any kind of innovation would not necessarily replace that. It will be on top of it. Right? So I think it's very important to be manage our expectations as well in terms of the potential impact of these new things.
That's encouraging.
And thank you. Any questions along these issues or comments? Otherwise, I'll come back to you a little later again.
Sorry, I'm working as a staff today, but I have a question. It might not be necessarily direct to the whole discussion, but I'm interested in a ChatGPT.
Of course.
And then I want to ask, how will it impact your field, or what's your future I don't know. I want to ask your comments, what kind of discussion among your colleagues or chat have you done about this? This is my question.
Thank you. I probably go straight to Jeffrey on this.
Well, I don't know about ChatGPT per se, in the sense that it doesn't matter at the moment for things we're writing, but large language learning models are extremely important in the long run, because a lot of the work we want to do is interpreting things we're seeing in satellite imagery, and it's very hard to get machine learning to do that well, in part because what a photo interpreter does is look at a picture and sees patterns that are not exactly pixels. What I mean by that is, I might look at a facility and I might say, well, that's a missile facility. And if you ask me why, I would say, well, there's a sports field here, and that's usually associated with a military base, because military units have a lot of young men who feel the need to exercise. And this is a building that you can drive through. And missiles tend to be driven around on vehicles, and they tend to be very large, so you drive them through facilities rather than back in and out. And this building is what we call a high bay building. It's very tall so that you can erect the missile and then put it back down. And it's very hard to do that from a traditional just comparing pixels way. There's a huge amount of interpretation that we do when we analyze images, and that to get a machine to do that has to go beyond just comparing two pictures and looking for something that's the same, and moving into this area of language learning models, which I think is the fundamental thing that's happening with ChatGPT.
Good morning. My name is Ali, and I'm a recent graduate from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And then I have two more questions from Martin. If you could, you introduced some tweet scrapping tools that the UN staff are using. Could you introduce some other tweet scrapping tools that could be used by individual independent researchers and open for everyone? My other question was with regard to the threats of use of technology, because it's not only the state actors and those actors who are trying to preserve international peace and security to use technology. We see the use of technology by the spoilers as well. For example, the Taliban use of Twitter to spread propaganda in Afghanistan, or the recent spy balloon over the US. And the American drones, for example, that are being captured in Ukraine, and they end up to Iran, and who knows what they are being used in the future. Could you please explain also about some of the challenges, upcoming challenges of the rise of technology? Thank you.
Martin, go ahead.
Well, I just want to echo what Jeffrey said, and on top of that, there are a lot of geospatial information out there for free, like environmental satellites, wildfire detection system from NASA that we use for frontline monitoring. There's a lot of free stuff out there that is put out for the public good that researchers haven't fully tapped into yet. So apart from kind of more affordable images that we can purchase with a swipe of a credit card, there are kind of geospatial information at our fingertips that we can use for the good, and we haven't fully exploited that. I wanted to make a quick comment also on LLMs, large language models, and ChatGPT-3 and the new affordances. We look at this very carefully because we can't really look under the hood, and the truth is that the algorithm has been based on a limited data set, so it's pretty biased. Throw questions at it that are more diverse, and we are serving the world. It sounds kind of futuristic, but it's true. Like 193 member states. Give you an example. Just this morning, we were discussing how GTP3 reacts to Georgian dialect. Like Abkhazia conflict that we are looking at, because we see, kind of an increase of tensions between Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and it performs very poorly on that. So when it comes to low resource languages, the models we've seen so far are not ideal. They are pretty biased, and we will see hopefully an improvement in the near future. Now, what it could do for us is really increase of productivity. So we're looking at automation for tagging social media posts or drafting processes, but we are very careful because of the biases that I just mentioned. Now, second point on open source tools, I'm not sure whether we have enough time to point you to all the tools that are out there. Happy to have a bilateral conversation. I just wanted to point out the UN Innovation Network. It's a website that basically brings together all the tools that the UN Innovation family has produced over the last years. And it indeed has been just recent. Other colleagues spoke about, kind of the mushrooming of innovation entities. We've seen a honeymoon period in the last years, and I agree. I think we come to realization that cost benefits, like, are we really seeing a change of business? But a lot of the products that are developed by the UN Innovation community are available on this website. If you type in UN Innovation Network, I think it's the first hit on Google. Google does us some service in that regard, at least. And then the last point on the threats of new technologies for peace and security, I just want to respond that indeed we are looking at this odd dance between seeing the harmful impact of new technologies, think about autonomous weapons or ways of how data privacy is undermined through, modern forms of intelligence, where we can have a full data footprint mapped out of you as an individual simply by the sheer amount of cameras and sensors out there that truly undermine data privacy, and the UN is very concerned about that. Vis-a-vis the affordances of that, all the good examples that I mentioned where we can use artificial intelligence to enhance dialogue processes. Now, we haven't talked about the metaverse at large, but that's an area that is fully unregulated yet. We look at the European Union that is thinking about regulating the metaverse, as they just passed a regulation on artificial intelligence. We're in a group of lawyers here mostly, so there will be more on the normative side, where reality is playing catch up with technologies. And in the metaverse, a good example where we've seen hate speech, harassment, and all the filters that social media companies have installed are not in place for the metaverse. So these are new places for recruitment of terrorist groups, and certainly a space where human rights are not necessarily upheld. So at the same time, the Council is debating whether or not cyber issues are a matter for international peace and security, and the world is not united on that. If you look at the last Security Council debate, which was on the 23rd of May, 2022, hosted by the United States, just less than a year ago, you see that the world is still undivided. At least the council members at the time are undivided on whether or not cyber threats are constituting a threat to peace and security, to what extent, and what cyber attacks and so forth. So just to say that this is an ongoing debate, and I think, we'll see more on this on the normative side, but in the near future, the discussion will continue. Also because I think the private sector plays such a huge role. And if states believe that, and the Secretary General said that, if states believe that this can be just a matter for states, we would be fooled, given that the big tech companies certainly play a role in providing security, data privacy, and other issues related to human rights in this digital realm. Over from my end.
Thank you, Martin. That is that, as Jeffrey said, this is happening. This is going to change the way we do business, no matter we like it or not. And it's already starting. So what are the kinds of skills and experiences that we should obtain to navigate this changing, digitalizing world? And the follow-up question is, again, as scholars, instructors, students, what would be the role of universities in building those preparedness?
So many of these tools that we're using are not intended for the study that we're doing. My friends who founded Planet didn't think that this was going to be amazing to find Chinese nuclear weapons or anything like that. They had a general curiosity in how would the world change if you took a picture of it every day. And so you also have to have that same curiosity to say, here is a new tool, how can I use it? And so I think that's essential. The second thing is, I would say that it's really important to be comfortable with data and mathematical ways of thinking. I sometimes say that numeracy is the new literacy, because you can learn any of the software that we use. The software is very user-friendly. But all software, whether you are exploiting a satellite image or modeling the performance of a missile, it is doing math on your behalf, right? You have a file that is data, and you are doing mathematical operations in order to understand or visualize that data. And so you will be better at using those tools and more comfortable if you are familiar with data-driven ways of thinking. The great thing about the software is it does the math for you, so you don't have to be good at arithmetic. I'm terrible at arithmetic. I can't multiply to save my life. But I am comfortable thinking about things in a numerical way. And so I'm comfortable analyzing data. And so that makes it very easy for me to use a lot of this software, because what it is really doing is the arithmetic for me that I am too lazy or incapable of doing myself. But you do have to understand it conceptually.
How about you, Martin?
Two things come to mind for me. One is problem solving. I think the future of learning will not be about memorizing knowledge. It will be about skills that help us to solve problems. I loved as a child to learn poems and sing songs, and I remember how I had to learn German history and just repeat what the teacher said. I think in the future, machines are going to solve that for us, and we will be not judged as humans of how we memorize knowledge, but how we put machines to use to solve problems. That's number one. The second point, I think, that goes hand in hand with passion is experimentation and play. I think experimentation and play are the tools to unlock the new, whatever you call it, innovation, the new discovery. And we've seen this increasingly being used as tools in the private sector and in some public sectors. Think about the Mad Scientist Initiative of the US Army, or the Red Team of the French Army, or the German Foreign Ministry that has introduced creative ways of learning. Those will be the future. Creative problem solving, experimentation and play. That's the way of how we generate new things that help us to bring humanity forward.
Thank you. I think you're all saying really same thing, right? And it came also through your presentations that it's the willingness to test what we think we know or we don't know. Willingness to go and seek data rather than trusting the narrative that's out there. And a willingness to verify and learn, even if it means that you failed in the particular context, or you discovered that you actually did not know, or what you knew was not in fact true. So there's sort of open-mindedness to it. Any questions before we begin to close?
Thank you for today's amazing introduction. Actually, I'm a senior in university, and I will graduate from this university in 4 days. I'm very happy to be here. My question is about the impact of the collapse of SVB in US to your research field or the activity of NPO, because SVB has lend money to many startup companies, but it has collapsed, and the situation of financial market has very confusing now. So I'm wondering that it has impacted to the innovation of many countries, or many industries. The question is the impact of its collapse to your activity or fears.
Thank you. Actually, that was a very important question, and just follow up our comments about the impact of the bankruptcy of the Silicon Valley Bank, and that is a major source of funding for the startup companies in Silicon Valley. But so I think, Jeffrey, your friends established a Planet, and they also got subsidy fundings, right? So I think this the ecosystem of financing the startup companies and innovations are very important kind of key to apply technologies in social science, in the area of social sciences. So I'm wondering how we should kind of sustain, or should university be integrated, or education system integrated with this financial ecosystem, and what your university is doing. And also would like to ask Toshi and Martin as well, how you guys are kind of collaborating and try to move, procure the capitals for your tech activities.
So, in our case, we work with a lot of tech companies and startups in order to be able to sort of access newest and most exciting tools. And I think in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, and there's one additional bank in New York, we just don't know what the impact of that on that broader community is going to be yet. I think the Federal Reserve is very hopeful that the damage will be quite limited, but it's definitely true that so much of what we do depends on the vitality of the broader technical innovation that's going on. Having said that, this could be a serious event, but it's over the long term. I think we're not, a temporary loss in venture capital funding, I don't think is going to lead to a fundamental collapse in what we're seeing as being really rapid technical innovation. And so it does raise, as Akiyama Sensei asks, this question of what should the relationship of a university be to the tech sector? And at least for us, our answer has been that we're very enthusiastic about that relationship.
So one of the things that we wanted to do when founding Copernic was to really mobilize the untraditional funding to development, be it individual funding, corporate funding, and foundation, etc., non-ODA funding. What I have learned that in Japan, and probably similar in other countries, the typical NGOs are reliant on one or two funding sources, and both are from the government. And yet, so because our conscious decision not to rely on a single source or traditional source only, and then, so we've been diversifying quite a lot. So I think some of the external shocks like COVID didn't really affect our income so much. So that we have been quite lucky about that. So we try to get really diversified and tap into many, many different sources.
Martin, how are you?
Yeah, thanks for raising kind of the finances, right? It's an important issue for keeping things alive. So 3 thoughts here. Number one, most of the innovation work in the United Nations is funded through extra budgetary funding. So it doesn't come from the regular budget of the organization. It comes from generous member states, like the government of Japan, that believe and change technology and innovation. A lot of the work we do is funded through extra budgetary funding, including Japan. And we need that. We need member states that take a chance and say, look, we are going to invest into things that are not mainstream yet. That's my first point. Second point is that a lot of the work we do on technology is in partnership with tech companies that are good-hearted, because we've seen a lot of good-hearted CEOs and makers that generate new tech for the public good without a kind of instant financial benefit of it. The third point is indeed partnerships with academia. Depending on which academic institution we look at and what kind of country setting we're looking at, we often see curiosity as a key driver, science as an important value. Again, extra budgetary funding through good-hearted member states, in-kind contributions through CEOs that make new tech part of their investor agreements, and scientific partnerships. This kind of triumvirate will help us to keep the innovation ecosystem alive and fruitful.
Thank you, Martin. I am conscious of time because it's coming to midnight in New York. So I am going to begin to close. And I think that there are many possibilities we'd like to continue talking with you together. So hopefully this is the first iteration of the conversations to come. So thank you for the speakers, and thank you for the technical team, and thank you for the student volunteers, and thank you most of all for you to come and join us today.